If you look for Mapo Tofu around the world, you'll notice something strange. In Chengdu, it's a bold, intensely flavored dish made with ground beef, plenty of oil, Sichuan peppercorns, and chilies, the kind of food made to go with a big bowl of rice. In Japan, the beef is usually replaced with pork. It's sweeter, milder, and has become an everyday dish that the whole family can spoon over rice. And in America, some versions get rid of the meat entirely and are marketed as healthy, vegan, plant-based meals. They can look completely different, but they all share the same name, Mapo Tofu. So how did a cheap, hot meal once eaten by laborers end up more than 150 years later with the same name but completely different ways of making it? How was Mapo Tofu actually born? And what happened to it along the way? That's what we're going to talk about today. In Chengdu in the 1860s, there was a bridge called Wanfu Bridge. Every morning, porters, laborers, and small vendors passed through this area. One day, around noon, a porter carrying cooking oil walked into a small eatery beside the bridge and placed a block of tofu next to the stove. Then he scooped a spoonful of oil from the container he was carrying. "Mapo Chen, no meat today. Just cook this for me." Mapo Chen was born into the Liu family. Her husband's surname was Chen. Following the naming customs of the time, after marrying into the Chen family, people would refer to her as Madam Chen, whose maiden name was Liu. Regulars called her Mapo Chen, a nickname referring to the pockmarks on her face. Those porters and laborers were regular customers at the shop. To save money, they often brought their own ingredients and asked the Mapo Chen to cook them into a meal. And more often than anything else, they brought cheap tofu. If they had earned a little more that day, they might bring some pork or beef as well. Tofu by itself is mild. Simply steaming or boiling it wasn't exactly enough to satisfy someone after a day of hard physical labor. So Mapo Chen began transforming it. If a customer brought meat, she chopped it up and fried it in hot oil until it became fragrant. Then came chilies, Sichuan peppercorns, and fermented black beans. Next, she cut the tofu into small cubes, added them to the wok, poured in a little water, and let everything slowly simmer together. Finally, she finished it with another dusting of ground Sichuan peppercorn. Suddenly, the plain tofu became numbing, spicy, savory, and intensely aromatic. Even without meat, those powerful flavors were more than enough to make you finish a bowl of rice. According to the traditional story, this was the early form of Mapo Tofu. It could be made with pork or beef, or with no meat at all. Sometimes, even the cooking oil was supplied by the laborers themselves. But no one could have imagined where this improvised little dish was headed next, not even Mapo Chen herself. Word about Mapo Chen's tofu spread around Wanfu Bridge, and more people started coming to the shop to try it. People from inside the city were willing to walk miles just for a taste. Some writers even composed poems praising the dish. But here's the interesting part. People didn't remember the name of the restaurant. They remembered Mapo Chen and her tofu. Gradually, Mapo Chen stopped being just one woman's nickname. The name became tied to the dish itself. And eventually, people began calling it Chen Mapo Tofu. By 1909, Chen Mapo Tofu had already appeared in a book documenting everyday life in Chengdu. It had become one of the city's famous dishes. Outside Chengdu, however, very few people had heard of it. Then, a war sent huge numbers of outsiders pouring into the city. In 1937, Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China. Shanghai and Nanjing were engulfed in war, and China's nationalist government moved its wartime capital from Nanjing to Chongqing. Soon, large numbers of people from other parts of China began arriving in Chengdu. For many of these displaced people, the first question at mealtime was simple: what was cheap and what would fill you up? Mapo Tofu fit those needs almost perfectly. It was cheap, strongly flavored, and perfect with rice. And so more and more outsiders tasted this little Chengdu dish for the first time. By then, imitators had already appeared across Chengdu, putting up signs advertising their own Mapo Tofu. Mapo Tofu was no longer just the signature dish of one restaurant. It was becoming a Sichuan dish, copied again and again by different cooks. Then, in 1945, the war ended. People who had come from elsewhere began leaving Chengdu, and what they carried away was more than the relief of having survived the war. They also carried with them the memory of Mapo Tofu's flavor, and the dish traveled with them. Two years later, Chengdu writer Li Jieren published an article about Mapo Tofu. He wrote that by then, Mapo Tofu had already spread from Chengdu to Shanghai and Beiping, today's Beijing. But its cooking methods and seasonings, he said, had already changed again and again. If we want to know exactly what changed, the obvious thing to do is to go back to Chengdu and see how the old Chen family restaurant made it. But once we get back to Chengdu, the story actually becomes even more complicated. By around 1920, the old Chen Mapo restaurant had already settled on beef for the minced meat, and later added pig shan, broad bean, chili paste. But much bigger changes were still coming. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was founded. A few years later, China began the socialist transformation of privately owned businesses. In 1956, the Mapo Tofu restaurant was brought under state ownership. After nearly a century as a private business, it was no longer run by the Chen family. Even cooking techniques that had once existed mainly in a chef's hands began to be systematically recorded and organized. Before this, the way you learned to make a famous dish was mostly through a master teaching an apprentice. Now, the ingredients and the cooking steps had to be clearly written down. By 1960, a recipe for Chen Mapo Tofu appeared in 中国名开谱, or Chinese famous dishes. But just 6 years after that recipe appeared in print, the dish name was erased. In 1966, China entered the political upheaval known as the Cultural Revolution. Signs associated with the old order, especially those bearing personal names, were treated as symbols of an outdated past. The Chen Mapo sign was taken down, and even Mapo Tofu itself was renamed Mala Tofu, literally, numbing and spicy tofu. We came back to Chengdu hoping to find the most reliable version of the original. But the reality is this: even in the place where Mapo Tofu was born, the dish kept being rewritten. And once we follow it overseas, its transformation is only beginning. Today, if you want to make Mapo Tofu in Japan, you can walk into almost any supermarket and pick up a packet of Mapo Tofu sauce mix. Buy a block of tofu, pour the sauce into a pan, and within a few minutes, dinner is ready. For many Japanese families, Mapo Tofu isn't some unfamiliar Chinese dish. It's everyday home cooking. But here's the strange part. The Mapo Tofu Japanese families have eaten for decades is already very different from the versions commonly found in Chengdu. So how did a heavily seasoned street dish made to go with rice turn into a milder, less numbing, less spicy, slightly sweeter family meal? As a young man, Chen Keming lived an unsettled life. He moved through Chongqing, Nanjing, and Shanghai, and later traveled to Taiwan and Hong Kong. In 1952, he traveled to Japan with a friend, but they quickly ran out of money. Unable to speak Japanese, Chen ended up staying and making a living the one way he knew how, by cooking. Surprisingly, his cooking quickly earned him a reputation, and before long, even prominent figures in Japanese politics were coming to try his food. One day, a waitress said to him, "You're this good at cooking. Why don't you open your own restaurant?" That waitress was Yoko, the woman who would later become his wife. In 1958, the couple opened a restaurant called Shisen Hanteng Sichuan Restaurant in Tokyo's Shinbashi district. Chen, now 39, was in the kitchen himself. But the many Japanese customers simply weren't used to the flavors. Too spicy, too numbing, too oily, and many Sichuan ingredients were difficult to find in Japan. One day, his wife suggested, "Why don't you adjust it to what the customers actually like?" Chen decided to try less chili, less Sichuan peppercorn, less oil. If a seasoning was hard to find in Japan, he substituted something locally available. Every time he changed the recipe, his wife took the first bite. Still too spicy. Chen turned back to the stove and changed it again. And through one taste test after another, Mapo Tofu gradually became better suited to Japanese tastes. In 1960, they opened a second restaurant in Roppongi. By 1966, Chen had become a well-known Sichuan chef in Tokyo and began appearing on NHK cooking programs. To make the dish practical for ordinary home cooks, he simplified the recipe even further. As the programs aired, more Japanese viewers discovered Mapo Tofu and started trying to make it at home. But what truly brought Mapo Tofu into homes across Japan wasn't television. It was a packet of sauce. At the time, a food company called Marumiya was watching the market for its rice seasoning products shrink and desperately needed something new. Chen's success on television gave Marumiya an idea. They decided to take Mapo Tofu one step further. Instead of teaching people how to make it, why not simply do the hardest part for them? In 1971, Marumiya launched its Mapo Tofu no Moto, a ready-made Mapo Tofu sauce mix. Then, in 1978, the company introduced an even milder version called Amakuchi. As these sauce packets spread, Mapo Tofu gradually became an ordinary part of the Japanese family dinner table. But the dish didn't keep moving in only one direction, toward milder flavors. In 1999, his son, Chen Kenichi, opened a restaurant specializing in Mapo Tofu in Tachikawa, Tokyo. This time, he wanted Japanese diners to taste a version closer to the Mapo Tofu of Sichuan. The restaurant even put Sichuan peppercorn on the table so customers could add as much as they wanted. But at the time, many Japanese diners still had no idea just how powerful its numbing sensation could be. One customer mistook it for ordinary pepper and dumped a huge amount onto his Mapo Tofu. He took one bite, found the numbing sensation unbearable, and reportedly left the restaurant angry. Decades earlier, Chen Kemi had toned down the heat and numbness for Japanese diners. But decades later, his son began actively seeking out hotter, more numbing Sichuan flavors. But even bolder changes were happening beyond Japan. In the 1990s, a young British woman named Fusha Dunlop came to Chengdu to study Chinese culture at Sichuan University. Once she arrived, she quickly fell in love with Sichuan food. When her university program ended, she didn't leave Chengdu. Instead, she made a much more unusual decision. She enrolled in a professional cooking school to learn Sichuan cuisine. There, she learned far more than chilies and Sichuan peppercorns. She studied knife skills, heat control, seasoning, and the different flavor profiles that make up Sichuan cuisine. After returning to Britain, Dunlop turned what she had learned in Chengdu into an English language cookbook. In 2001, Sichuan Cookery was published, and Mapo Tofu was one of the recipes inside. The book went on to win a Best First Book award from Britain's Guild of Food Writers. For English-speaking readers, there was finally a detailed guide showing them how Sichuan food was actually made. You might expect Mapo Tofu in the West to stop moving closer and closer to the Chengdu version. Instead, almost the opposite happened. At Mission Chinese Food in San Francisco, a young chef named Danny Boyan was standing over the stove, reworking a pot of Mapo Tofu. Instead of the usual ground beef, he used tender braised pork shoulder. Then he added fish sauce, kombu, and cilantro. And here's the stranger part. At the time, Boyan had never even been to Sichuan. It wasn't until 2012, after his restaurant had become a hit, that he finally made a special trip to Chengdu to search for the Sichuan flavors he had been obsessed with. He ate with local chefs, watched them cook, and learned from them. And for the first time, he began to understand that Sichuan food wasn't simply about making everything hotter and more numbing. But that trip to Chengdu didn't make him stop changing the dish. Back in America, Boyan kept tinkering with his Mapo Tofu. By 2022, Boyan and his team estimated that since the San Francisco restaurant first opened, the dish had been changed roughly 100 times. And in the latest published version, he removed the meat entirely and replaced it with shiitake mushrooms. And Boyan is hardly the only person doing this. In American supermarkets, you can even find Mapo Tofu sold as a completely meat-free vegan frozen meal. No chef required. You don't even need a stove, just heat it up and eat. A hot dish once cooked to fill the stomachs of Chengdu laborers had traveled so far that even meat was no longer essential. So if even the meat can change, what exactly is this real Mapo Tofu we've been searching for all along? Today, Mapo Tofu can be found all over the world. From Chengdu's beef, heavy oil, and bold flavors, to Japan's pork and touch of sweetness, to vegan, plant-based versions in America. So which one is the real Mapo Tofu? 150 years ago, when Mapo Chen cooked with tofu brought in by porters and oil scooped straight from their own containers, she was already making the dish with whatever was available. Adaptation was baked into its DNA from the very beginning. Maybe authenticity was never about rigidly sticking to one recipe. Maybe it was about something much simpler. Wherever the dish goes, it still has to satisfy the people eating it. And that helps explain why, even after the recipe has changed almost beyond recognition, people around the world have held on to the name that was born beside Chengdu's Wanfu Bridge, Mapo Tofu.